gender interchangeably, and they conflate them often, right? So sex, again, just as a refresher, biological aspects, the sort of physiological aspects, the genitals, the presentation of the genitals, and the chromosomes that one carries with them. And we've already sort of put a pin in it, and we've recognized that, in fact, our understanding of this as a generalized sense is very limited, which we'll come back to in a moment. But we want to now turn our attention just a little bit to gender. So what is gender? Gender is a social construction, okay? It is constructed, it changes over time, it has been different historically, it is different cross-culturally, and gender is a social construction assigned around people whose biological sex is one or another, right? It's what we expect people to do based on these physiological characteristics. And the important part of this is it is a social construction. It is made up shit. That's it. It's just made up. And then we apply it to people. Okay? They're not the same thing. And the other one, gender, is a social construction only. So if we go back for a moment to talk about sex, right? These biological aspects, the physiological characteristics, how one's genitals look, what their chromosomes say. We, again, have often been led to believe that this comes in a limited number of expressions, and that's simply not true. So intersex, for any of you who have seen the acronym is LGBTQIA+, this is the I, okay? So intersex is an umbrella term, and it includes lots of variations. It's an umbrella term that indicates an individual either has a mismatch between the chromosomes and the genitals. So the presentation of the genitals is inconsistent with the chromosomes, or the genitals are ambiguous, meaning not clearly a penis or not clearly a vulva. Now, for many of you on this call, some of us of certain ages probably are thinking, I think I have heard a different term that means what you're saying, right? I think I've heard this term. I don't know if I know that much about intersex. Maybe you do, but I think I've heard another term for that. And so I'm guessing that some of you have heard the term hermaphrodite, right? And so hermaphrodism is an actual intersex condition, okay? It is when an individual has an ovary and a testis, because in fact, the ovaries and the testes are made of the same embryonic tissue, and for a host of complicated reasons, an individual may have one of each, okay? But that is not the correct term. It's in fact a pejorative term today. And the reason it's pejorative is because it has been associated with all kinds of negative connotations, really circus sideshows and all these kinds of things. So the correct term is intersex. And when I ask students whether or not they think intersex conditions, right, again, umbrella term, lots of things that fall underneath it, whether they're common or it's rare, most people will say it's very, very rare. That is incorrect. So in fact, an obvious intersex condition is present in every 1 out of 1,500 to 2,000 live births, okay? To be clear, to make this a little easier for us to understand, that's roughly the same ratio as being born with naturally occurring red hair. Now, I'm sure this isn't true for the folks on this call, but it's often true with my students. I have to make sure that it's clear. I am not saying people who are born with red hair are also intersex. Okay, what I am saying is that for as often as you have met someone with naturally occurring red hair is how often you have met someone who is intersex. Okay? The reason we think it's rare is because we don't talk about it. All right, so we've kind of already talked a little bit about sex versus gender. Again, sex, the biological aspects, we already now know too. Well, that isn't even just, binary in and of itself. There's all these intersex conditions. So in fact, biological sex is even a continuum, right? Gender is a social construction, right? We sort of dictate what we think people who identify as one particular gender are supposed to behave. So now we're going to turn our attention for a little while to gender identity, okay? And that's our own personal understanding of our identity. So many of you have heard the term cisgender. Some of you have not. It might be new to you. But essentially, cisgender individuals is where there is what their biological sex, the sex they were assigned at birth. And some people are like, what are you talking about, sex assigned at birth? What do you even mean? So typically, when a baby is born, they look at the genitals and assign the sex. Now, some people actually have chromosomal tests, but we already know these are some of the difficult things as well. But that's what we mean when we say sex assigned at birth. So for a cisgender individual, okay, the biology, presentation of genitals, the chromosomes, match how they see themselves, right? All of that goes in line, okay? This is in contrast to someone who might identify as transgender. Again, this is an umbrella term, okay? Often now we will see it abbreviated as trans, okay? And this is where someone's gender identity, their personal internal understanding of their gender identity is different in some way than the sex they were assigned at birth. Now, some of us are most familiar with sort of binary experiences, right? So I was assigned male at birth, I identify as female. I was assigned female at birth, I identify as male. Okay, that's a binary trans experience. But this also includes non-binary. I don't identify in that way, right? Gender queer, gender fluid, where somebody's identity changes or shifts. People who feel as though they don't have a gender or multiple genders as well. So again, that umbrella term. So just to give us a little bit more understanding, right? So gender identity can be a sense of oneself as transgender, queer, a woman, a man, or some other identity. And our gender identity may or may not coincide with our sex and gender assigned at birth. Okay. Now, oftentimes we think, oh my gosh, this whole gender fluidity, all these other genders and non-binary and all these things are just really uncommon. And this is just a brand new iteration of modern society. Not true, okay? Absolutely not true. This is only one example, right? But in fact, there are multitudes of them. Many, many Indigenous and First Nations countries and communities have these types of identities. One happens to be two-spirit, which is more common in our First Nations people, right? And this is where folks were assigned, often in this case, assigned male at birth and have some other gender identity, right? Often a female or female similar gender identity. These were embraced within these communities, and often we only saw the ostracism of two-spirit communities or gender expansive communities really being marginalized with the introduction of colonization. So this is not a modern iteration, right? This has gender expansiveness has been around time immemorial, right? And it is only now that we're beginning to talk about it again. It has been present in many communities for a very long period of time, and we're stigmatized based on colonization. Okay. So first, let me take a pause because I know we've gotten through a lot of information, and I have my trusty companion C here with me. Are there any questions about the difference between sex and gender? Any questions around some of the terms we talked about gender identity? All right, so C says there's nothing in the chat, so I'll just keep moving forward. Okay, so if sex is the biological aspects, okay, and gender identity is our personal understanding of our gender, okay, then we also have something called gender expression. So for example, I identify as a cisgender female. I was assigned female at birth and I identify as female, right? And so in that, I then express to the world my gender through gender expression, right? And this can also ranges on a continuum, right? Which may be a masculine presentation, it might be a feminine presentation, it might be an androgynous presentation. Again, to be clear, this gender expression is unrelated both to our gender identity and to our sex assigned at birth, meaning I can identify as a cisgender female, which I do, and my gender expression could be masculine. It could be androgynous, or it could be feminine, right? And there is all kinds of variation within that. So here are just some examples that we, of course, have seen, popular representations, right, of the ways in which folks express their gender. So this is kind of how we put that presentation out into the world. All right. So we talked about sex, the biological aspects. We talked about gender, the social construction, and our personal understanding of our gender identity. We have talked about how we perform gender, right? Our gender expression, how we put our gender out there, okay? And now we're going to talk about sexual orientation. And sexual orientation, again, I mentioned at the beginning when we first started looking at the gender unicorn, that you can be emotionally attracted to someone, physically and sexually attracted to someone, and those might be different. But for the purposes of this conversation, we're going to lump them together. Okay. So in terms of sexual orientation, we're really going to be talking about who are the people that we wish to be in romantic and sexual relationships with, if sexuality is a part of those relationships. Okay. So here is kind of two continuums that run into each other. One is how much sexual attraction someone feels. Right? Do they feel a lot of sexual attraction? Do they feel kind of a little bit of sexual attraction? Or for our folks on the asexual spectrum, really don't feel sexual attraction. That's not a part of their they don't have those attractions. Okay. And then at the bottom is kind of who you're into, right? So, and again, it probably should be clear, but if it's not, I will help you to understand our sexual orientation may be distinct from our behavior. So someone can have a sexual orientation, for example, many young people come to know what their sexual orientation is, at least by puberty, right? Which makes perfect sense because this is the transition biologically between being able not to reproduce and to reproduce. And so feelings of sexual interest typically go hand in hand with that. And at some point during that pubertal period, people come to understand who they are kind of attracted to. Many of those young people, most in fact, are not sexually active at all. However, that doesn't change their sexual orientation, right? So behavior is not dictated by your sexual orientation. Where does this come into play? Less common today, much more common when I was young, that people who identified as gay or lesbian were often asked, well, how do you know if you're gay or lesbian if you haven't had sex with somebody of the opposite sex? That's a silly thing to say, right? Because our sexual orientation is our identity and it is irrespective of our behavior. Okay. So again, we have this continuum about how much sexual attraction we feel, and then at the bottom of this particular scale, who we're sexually attracted to. And people may use different labels to describe this. It may change over time, all of those things. So heterosexual or straight are people who are typically sexually, physically, emotionally, and romantically attracted to members of the opposite sex. Gay or lesbian. Gay is typically an umbrella term, but more often to be applied to those who identify as male than female. These would be men who are romantically, sexually, and emotionally interested in men. Lesbian, women who are interested in women. We're going to skip, well, let me ask the audience. What is the difference between, oh, I should not touch the screen because things happen, bisexual and pansexual? This is often one that comes up for folks. Now, this is just a joke. Sometimes when I would teach this, I would say pansexual. People look at me like, what is that? And I would say, I assure you, it's not that they're attracted to pans. Okay. So what is the difference between bisexual and pansexual? Again, no one gets to dictate anybody's sexual orientation but themselves. They define their own definition for that, but broad brush strokes, what's the difference there? Anybody want to hazard a guess? You could just unmute, go crazy, participate, but not all at once, because then you make me nervous.
Hey, hi everyone. From my understanding, bisexual is a little bit of an older term, and a lot of people who identify as bi, like it's kind of like a self-identification thing, whether one identifies as bi or pan. I mean, when you're bi, typically it has to do with you know, the kind of old like gender binary, like being into you know, males and females, whereas being pan is being into just anyone, regardless of gender or not.
Yes. Noah, excellent. And thank you for participating. I really appreciate that. And I will not take offense at the older term, because I think it's designed to talk about people my age, right? So it is in fact true that for some of us, we're much more familiar with the term bisexual than we are with pansexual. And again, people identify in any way that they wish. Their definition of that label is their own, but just broad brushstrokes. Bi, right? You see bi right in there, binary. These are individuals, typically speaking, and yes, people who are older are more likely to identify in this way, who are, okay, who are interested in both quote unquote males and quote unquote females, right? They're interested in both sides of the binary, okay? Pansexual, this is something I think is kind of an easy way of understanding this. It's all the hearts and all the parts, right? So it is someone who is interested in folks across the spectrum, okay? Both the spectrum of biological sex and the spectrum of gender identity. So they're not only interested in folks at the binaries, but all the folks along the continuum. Okay? And this is more of a term that is used with folks who are a little bit younger. I have been instructed to look at the chat. Yep. Great. Yeah, typing is not always the best. Exactly. So by the binary, pan, all the hearts, all the parts. Okay. Asexual. Okay. Asexual folks are those who have romantic relationships, emotional relationships. They are fulfilled in those relationships. However, sexual attraction or sexual activity is not a part of those relationships typically. Right? Demisexual is, you know, people will often talk about this as they don't initially experience a lot of sexual attraction, but that builds with getting to know someone, so that their sexuality is based on the individual, not so much in sexual attraction. Okay. So what's queer, right? Queer is like a big old umbrella term that just lets people say, essentially, not lets, but indicates I am something other than straight or heterosexual. Where I fall in the continuum, all of those, you don't really know when someone says that they're queer, but it means essentially I am not straight or exclusively straight. Okay. Now, for those of you, so just, you know, full disclosure, I'm 47 years old. When I was growing up, there was a game called Smear the Queer. Some of you will be familiar with this, right? Queer was an amazingly derogatory, divisive, and insulting term. So many folks either will not ever personally identify as queer, okay, and would never feel comfortable using that term. And I want to honor that history, right? But many of the younger generation, under 35 is typically what we see, have really participated in a reclamation of language around that term, right? So they've taken a term, folks have taken a term that has been used to disparage our community and reassert it as a positive term. And that's why we often see the queer and trans community. Again, in both of those instances, we're talking about big brushstrokes, umbrella terms, right? Excellent. So times, they are a changing for sure. So this is really interesting, and I put the links on here for you, and I wanted to pull also the numbers. I wrote them down on my thing. So what we see is with each generation, increasing identification with the queer trans community, right? So right now, about 18% of those folks born after 1997 identify in some way, shape, or form with the queer identity, okay? And 4% with trans identity. In the previous generation, millennials, that percent's about 10%. Before that, my generation, right, Gen X, the original slackers, 6%. So what we see are folks feeling more comfortable. Now, this comes up every time. Are there then more queer or trans people than there have been? Probably not, right? Any of you who have seen, I really like this graph, actually. Have any of you seen the graph that showed left-handedness? So we used to punish people for using their left hand, right? And so left-handedness was really low. Percentage of people who would say, I'm left-handed, right? And when we stopped punishing people, forcing them to write with their right hands, what happened to the rates of left-handedness? They went up. Did more people become left-handed, or did more people, or did less people fear punishment and retribution for living their authentic self, right? So it is probably not the case that we are having some proliferation based on some sort of modern understanding, but rather people can more fully live and work and love in the world, and therefore their comfort with identifying has increased. Yeah, and as we see, right, there are still people who are being discouraged from using their left hand, right? As we know, people are still being discouraged from living their authentic gender and sexuality in the world. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about intersectionality, or the ways in which, so every single one of us lives at the intersections of all the identities that we hold. Okay, these include education, sexuality, ability, age, gender, parenting, if you're a parent or not, and all of those influence us differently, okay? So you probably are familiar with Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, who litigated, she's a law professor, a very famous case, and I believe it was against Ford Motor Company, right? And what she essentially was arguing was there were Black women working on the line of this automotive field or automotive plant. And essentially, they were being treated differently, not because they were women and not because they were Black, but because they were Black women, right? And so that you could not separate those two things, that the intersection of the identities at which they lived created this situation in their workplace. By the way, it wasn't a successful case. They actually lost the case. So oftentimes what happens, or what we're encouraged to think about, is this idea of oppression Olympics. Who has it the worst? And that's not really what intersectionality means. It's not who has it worse. It's about how systems of oppression affect people differently, right? And so because we got a late start, because of all of those things, I'm just going to really encourage you to look at this. You can find it on YouTube, and it's called Emma's Dilemma. And it's just a really nice presentation. This is Dr. Crenshaw talking about all of these things. Oops. Okay. So we've seen a lot of this, especially around the recent years, is that you cannot separate, right, the fight for liberation and justice for the queer and trans community and not also recognize and fight for racial liberation and justice, right? So if we look at, for example, if you look at our community college students, the students that have the highest rates of being unhoused, Black trans women, okay? That is the intersection. That is an intersection of racism, misogyny, right? There are limited opportunities and more limited, there are very limited opportunities for trans folks and more limited opportunities for Black trans folks, particularly women. It is very important to note that 70% of the queer and trans California community college students are also students of color. Right? So we can't, and what has traditionally happened, right, is that spaces that serve queer and trans students tend to be very white. Right? And they sort of don't deal with, acknowledge, focus on the racial identities of the students we serve, who are largely Black and brown. And we've missed that opportunity. Right? In our racial affinity groups, we could all do a better job. Every one of us could do a better job of acknowledging all the aspects of our students' identities, right? So these two things cannot be peeled apart, right? They are interconnected, interrelated. It is one fight for liberation. Which is why you often see now, right, the progressive flag, right? So we've all sort of seen the traditional rainbow flag that's represented here. These are, don't touch things, don't touch things. Okay. The trans flag is incorporated and striped for Black and brown to acknowledge the intersecting nature of the work that we do and for the combined liberatory fight. Okay. So what are typically some of the experiences that students have on campuses? So whether you're talking about middle school, high school, or college, queer and trans students, in comparison to their cisgender or heterosexual counterparts, feel less safe and less welcome on their campuses. Okay? Queer and trans students are more likely to seriously consider suicide, to experience housing and food insecurity, and be rejected by their family. Okay, there are many, many ways in which this plays out. There are, I didn't want to get too deep into all of the statistics, but we'll say a few things here. 50% of queer and trans high school students fear they will be beaten up at school. Okay, that is compulsory education, high school is, and they are afraid for their physical safety. Okay, that's very telling. When we look at involvement in certain systems, if we look at the incarceration system, if we look at foster care, there are 1.5 to 2 times more kids in foster care, queer and trans kids in foster care, than out of foster care. Why are they there? Their parents have rejected them and they have been placed into the system or have found themselves into the system. More likely to be involved in the juvenile justice system, more likely to be housing insecure. There are just a myriad of ways in which this is the case. And typically our queer and trans students, and this is true when I was the ARC Pride Center coordinator, we did a campus climate survey on our campus looking at 1,200 students. And what we found very reliably is that queer and trans students were reporting feeling not very welcome in their classes, that they were afraid. Some of them, a smaller proportion, thankfully, were afraid that there would be some sort of physical ramifications, violence towards them. Many of them felt emotional, right? They felt like they went into classes, they were not seen, they were ridiculed, their identities were up for discussion, right? I'm not going to use your name I'm not going to use the pronouns you're asking me to, and this is up for discussion, right? It's interesting. We have really seen, right, how many queer and trans students have flocked to online education. How many are enrolled in online only classes and don't turn on their cameras and don't do those things. And it has been a way of minimizing some of the harms that they sometimes experience in their classrooms. Okay. You probably are aware or may be aware of some of the recent research that came out, also showing that young people, right, experienced more, I believe this was in the New York Times, more abuse during the COVID pandemic when people were at home, right? Kids were more likely to experience abuse. We were probably all pretty sure about that was going to happen. And who's more likely to experience that? Queer and trans students, or queer and trans young people. Many of our students are forced to go back into the closet when they're isolated at home. Many of our students actually live a different identity on our campuses than they do at home, as they come to terms with their own identity, as they try things on, or as they are able to find safe spaces, right? So, like, what do we do? How do we help? What are things that we can actually do to improve the experiences for students on campus? We could get into all of this, but you'll see this all in the presentation. So there's a lot of discussion about co-conspirators or accomplices or allies. So the kind of, one of the issues, right, is that an ally stands beside someone or a community, right? But there's not a lot of skin in the game, right? An accomplice is actually actively engaged in the work and is willing to use their privilege, positionality in order to positively influence change. It's really about how much the investment is, how much of your own personal skin there is in the game. This is a great little video, but again, because we don't have a ton of time, I'll just share it with you and you all can watch it after. All right. So let's talk a little bit about biases, the types of biases, how they come into play, those kinds of things. So unconscious or implicit biases are ones that we may not really be aware of. Now, there's some argument actually in the research world about whether we're not aware of them. But let's say this. We are inculcated with societal messages all the time, from the time we're very, very young, right? On a whole host of topics. And those associations they influence the way in which we view the world. Who is a scholar? Who is dangerous? Who is a caregiver, right? These are biases that we may or may not be aware of that then influence our behavior, right? And then some folks and some of us may have some very conscious biases, right? Where we're like, yep, I don't like those people. I don't think these are good people, whatever. And then there's microaggressions, right? Which are these slights that happen every day and kind of connote what we really believe or think. And they marginalize and minimize people. You've probably heard this before. Death by a million paper cuts, right? They're not big, they're small and ever present. So what we're going to do is we're going to kind of look at some scenarios that we've sort of made up. And some of these are from experiences that happened in different classes or across different experiences. And we're just going to think about the ways in which we might be able to take these scenarios. So a student named Ryan emails you about being in your class in the fall. Ryan indicates that they use they, them pronouns and asks that you use their name or those pronouns when addressing them. You're impressed with this student's confidence, but you wonder about the other queer and trans students who might not feel as comfortable reaching out. What can you do to make your classroom inclusive and welcoming to queer and trans students? Now, to be clear, there is not one answer to this, right? There are many, many, many. pardon me, answers to this question. But if somebody wants to be kind of bold and unmute themselves and tell me, like, what do you think? Like, how do you handle this? Have you had this experience before? What are things that you do to make your classroom more inclusive and welcoming? What are things you're thinking about doing? Again, not all at once. You make me nervous.
I'll do a small one, Emily.
Well, you have to, Diana, or I would just harass you endlessly. Yeah.
If I received, or when I receive emails like that, starting with a really welcoming response of, I'm so happy to have you in the class and support you. And, my goal is to help you be successful in the course. So really just kind of being very welcoming in your initial response. And then also, including your pronouns in your email signature or on your Zoom name, just so that kind of as a signal that you are familiar with that and support that. And, just kind of a couple small things that come to mind.
Awesome. So all of those things are things we talk about, right? So we do a lot of modeling behavior, right? So for one thing, one of the things that Diana brought up is making sure that your response to this student, because I assure you, this student is waiting for a response, right? They are sitting at home thinking, what happens next? So when they receive that, oh my gosh, thank you so much for sharing that with me. I really appreciate that. That's great. I'm so excited for you to be in the class. We're going to learn so many great things together, right? Also, as we just talked about, sharing and doing modeling behavior, right? Adding your pronouns to your email signature, perhaps with a link to why are pronouns important, that kind of thing, and different types of things. Wearing a button, if that's what you would like. Any of those things. Having folks, if they want, introduce or use their pronouns, directing them towards services as well. The other thing, and I know many of you on this call do all the time, is welcome letters to students. This is just a port that I use. So the name we choose to be called is an essential part of our identity, and every student's identity should be honored. If you use a name that is different from your legal name, you can indicate your affirmed or chosen name by completing this form. In our case, that's just to go into self-service. Also, please share your pronouns with me. I use she, her pronouns. If you need any additional assistance, please reach out, right? So one is acknowledging that people's identities are important, directing them towards services, which if you don't know, Los Rios has a very comprehensive affirmed name policy. Folks can indicate their affirmed name in their self-service portal, and that lived or affirmed name will populate throughout our system anywhere that is not a legal document. What are the legal documents? Your transcripts, financial aid awards. Our rosters will only show their affirmed or lived name. They can also indicate their pronouns, and we fairly regularly update those options. Right? You can also indicate your pronouns on Canvas as well. And so letting students know that that's an option for them, that you know how to help them do those things, is also very, very important. Okay, so what if I mess up? Like, what if someone tells me their pronouns and I don't use the right pronoun? I say the wrong pronoun. I don't use it the way they want. Okay. So it's not if you're going to mess up, you're going to mess up. It's going to happen. You're going to make a mistake. Everybody makes mistakes. That's part of being human. What you need to do is recognize that you may have hurt someone by misgendering them. Apologize quickly, correct, and move on. Here's what I mean. So student comes into class. They've told you that their pronouns are she, her. You use the wrong pronouns, you use he, him, you know you've made a mistake, just say, so you might be saying, okay, he said, she said, and move on. Afterwards, follow up and be like, I know I made a mistake, I really apologize, I'm working on it, right? Do not make this about you, okay? So you make that mistake and you're like, oh my God, I totally didn't mean for that to happen. I am totally like, I've been to all these trainings. I'm like an ally of the community. Meanwhile, your student is crawling under the desk and hoping to just like fade into the background, right? I apologize. We do not want to make a big deal. Apologize and move on. And just like you would do for anybody else you may have hurt, circle back and make amends, right? Do better, right? Oh, goodness. Okay. Yeah, that's a really great idea, Noah. One thing so Noah mentioned in the chat that he makes it a part of the like sort of first day activities, going around, giving your name, giving your pronouns. You always want to give the option that if people don't want to do that, that's okay, right? Some folks are still just kind of working it through, but you might say something like, hey, if you feel comfortable, share your pronouns with me, right? And this is a really telling study. Excuse me. So using a transgender's chosen name at work reduces depression symptoms by 71%, reduces thoughts of suicide by 34%, and reduces suicide attempts by 65%. So it's not just nice, right? This is imperative for the health and well-being of our trans students, who often find themselves at much higher rates, both of thoughts of suicide and actual attempts of suicide. By the way, if you kind of look at the data overall, what you find is these numbers go down exponentially by the number of supportive people in their lives. So having one supportive person in your life who acknowledges your identity drops that rate by half. And having 2, 3, 4, it increasingly drops that number. So again, using folks' names, their pronouns, across the different aspects of their life really is life-saving choices for these students and individuals. Okay, you assign your online asynchronous class, okay, up into breakout groups. I think I mean you broke up your groups, that's okay, to work on a class assignment. As you pop in and out of the breakout groups, you observe that one of your students seems to be getting upset. The student suddenly leaves the Zoom session. Another student in the group says that Sid, that's the student, was upset because another team member questioned them about their androgynous appearance and kept asking them if they were a boy or a girl, right? So we have seen some of this. This is, we see it in in-person classes. Online, we often see things being posted, right, in discussion boards or things like that, and maybe in these group breakout sessions. So the question is, you know, like, what do you do? What do you say? Anybody want to tell me how they think they would handle that situation? So when we did the campus climate study at ARC, one of the things that we found is that fortunately there was not a high percentage of people indicating that they had been mistreated in classrooms, but of the percentage that did, let's say 5%, there's a very common theme to how this looked. And what it looked like, as you put sort of all the puzzle pieces together, is they'd be in a class. Now this was done before pre-pandemic, so almost all of these classes were in person. A student would say something, right? Disparaging, derogatory, that felt offensive to the student, something along this lines, right? And the faculty member would say nothing. Now, a faculty member for 18 years, I know we do this job because we care deeply about students. I also know that there's kind of a basic human reaction when we don't know what to do nothing, right? We may get flustered. We don't know how to handle it. What's the right thing to say? How do I deal with it? And so you go, I can't deal with this, so I'm just not going to say anything. Well, what does the student who's had this happen to them take from that? You support the behavior that has occurred, right? That is the inference that they make. So again, when we say nothing, now you're like, but I was on the spot, like I can't do it. That's okay, circle back, right? It is okay to come back, but you have to say something. Let me go back to this. So some of the things that we can do to head off these situations is having community agreements in a classroom, right? What are things that are okay? What are things that are not okay? So for, a decade, almost a little more, I taught human sexuality. And we would actually role play what are kind of like appropriate questions and what are things that like kind of walk the line, right? In this particular situation with Sid, first and foremost, one of the things that's important is to circle back with Sid. Right? Hey, I know this went down. I see this. What would you like to see happen here? How can I support you? Now, a student might be like, I want that student kicked out of school. They probably really don't, but that's what I want to have happen. You're like, well, I can't make that happen. Yeah, you can. You know what you can do? You can direct them to services. You can connect them to services on campus, like our Pride Center, our Center for Inclusion and Belonging, so that they can get the support. You can also just be supportive. I'm sorry, that sucks. That was really hard. That's not okay. And then you circle back, both with that individual student who may have made those statements. And, it's a hard balance, right? Because we don't want to alienate students who are in the learning process too, right? We don't just want to shut everybody down like, you're the worst person ever. You did this thing. Get out. You're horrible. No, we don't want to do that either. But we have to have some norms around behavior. Tanika, I see your hand is raised.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to say, thank you for going over this, because I think it's a hard one. And I think also like more practice with just hearing how, just some ideas of how to do it really works. Really what I wanted to comment to say is like, thank you for going over this. And also one of the things I've learned, because this happens not just right with this topic, but a whole host of other things where things are said. What I have done, I've come to say, I'm not quite sure what to do. And I just say it. I don't know what to do in this moment, but I know what's happening doesn't sit well with me, and it's not sitting well with everyone else. So we're going to need to circle back to this. And I feel like that at least gives everyone, like, I feel like I'm transparent enough to say, like, I don't know what to do, but I know this isn't where we need to go. And then I feel like that lets everyone know that there's some time that there's going to be some more conversation about it. So sometimes just being honest, saying, I don't know what to do, but this isn't going to continue.
Yeah, I think that's perfect. I also think acknowledging your own discomfort about this, like, I don't really know exactly what we're going to do right, or what the next thing is, but that really hit me in a place that did not feel good. I want to really say this and stress this. This is particularly true if you are not the member of the marginalized community, right? So if someone is being hurt and you hold privilege and positionality, it is such a powerful thing for you to say, hold on, that hurt me. Hold on, I'm not okay with that, right? Because oftentimes what we default to is requiring the people who are being harmed to advocate for themselves in isolation. And that is just, it's bad on every side of it, right? And this is kind of that allyship accomplice like kind of thing, right? Are you like, yeah, that sucks, sorry that happened? Or are you willing to be like, that really didn't sit well with me. I'm not comfortable with what was said here. I'm not okay with this. And Tanika, I think that's perfect. I think circling back and saying, you know what, I need a minute. And let's say you don't even do that. You don't even react in that moment. It just hits you in the face and you're overwhelmed and you do not know what to do. Next class period, next time you're online, hey, I was thinking about yesterday's class. I need to come back to it. I need us to stop and hold some space right now and kind of talk about it. It's okay to step away and formulate your thoughts. We just can't just drop it and move on. That's really where things don't go well, right? And, this is just, what we're talking about here. Recent research shows that 16% of trans students leave their campuses because of the treatment that they experience. They don't find themselves welcomed and they leave, right? And that is real, right? And so what we see sometimes in the data, we're also data driven, whatever, but we don't always know what questions we're asking, is if you look at like GPAs or, progression, sometimes, the queer and trans community look fine. You look at retention, not so much. They're here one semester, not the next semester, right? So we really see this in all those ways. Thank you for sharing that, Cynthia. That's very helpful. Okay, we'll try to get to this one just a little bit, but we're quickly running out of time, unfortunately. So you've been asked to head the committee for the cultural celebrations at school. So this is like, we're kind of been talking about what happens in a classroom, but guess what? This also happens with our colleagues, right? This stuff goes on in our own communities, in the other parts of our communities. Your team is mapping out the calendar and the topic of Pride celebrations come up. You have a colleague who says, I don't understand why people insist on calling it Pride. We used to be proud of raising children, doing well in school, and buying a house. Now we are proud of who we have sex with and the fact that we let men wear dresses. So you're in this meeting, right? Just so you know, this actually happened, right? And so what do you say? What do you do? And I want to be clear, I don't have the right answer, because there isn't a right answer, but you got to do something, right? And so when we're talking about intervening, there are a number of ways that we can do this that helps to reduce defensiveness and perhaps opens the conversation. So one is paraphrasing or repeating back to them what they just said. Sometimes when people hear what they say, they're like, oh, wait, that did not sound good. Ask for more information, play dumb, challenge the stereotype, promote empathy. One of the ones that I find pretty useful, especially if I'm with a student more, colleagues, it gets complicated, and then let's just even talk about power dynamics, right? That's even more complicated. You're the person with less power, and somebody who has more power or prestige in an organization says something that's just totally outrageous, or not even totally outrageous, just offensive. What do you do? How do you do it? I don't have the right answers at all. But one of the things that has worked successfully for me in the past is people love to hear good things about themselves. So I will often say, I know you to be a kind person. I know you to be aware. And this statement strikes me as not consistent with who you are. And they often will be like, oh, yes, you're right. Right. So but you got to lead with the positive, right? Because once we are like, hey, that's not okay. We've all been there. You say something to someone, their defensiveness gets triggered and it's done, right? They're not going to hear it because they're like, you're saying I'm a bad person, right? Like that's not really what I'm doing. But these are some decent ideas about it. Okay, we have about 2 minutes left and so much information I wish we could cover. But I wanted to just stop and say, are there any questions that you all have? Check chat. Thanks, Steve. Yeah, that's exactly what we were just talking about, right, Tanika? You don't look to the person who's in the community. So Sid, tell me more about how that made you feel, right? That is not what we should do, right? So I'll just review our final takeaways and thank you as well for your patience and understanding and flexibility with everything that happened today. So recognize that we all have a lot to learn, but more importantly, we have a lot to unlearn, right? You all are probably, I think David Wallace Forrester, what's the water, right? You're the fish in a water bowl. One fish turns to the other and says, what's the water? That's the culture we live in, right? We have a lot to unlearn. We have been sold a lot of information that turns out not to be true, and we have carried it with us. And that is a lifelong journey. So showing up and how we show up, it's not perfection. It's always progress. We could always do better, and we could always learn more. Recognize the privileges that we do have and use those, right, in ways that benefit people who have been excluded from those privileges. Understand that we all have different lenses and lived experiences. So on my morning run this morning, I like hidden brain. It's kind of my thing. And they were talking about mindset, right? And it's like, mindset is like what you think about something and how that changes. And there was all this very interesting research on how that changed the way you look at the world. So literally, based on our experiences and what we believe, we may have very different lenses of the world. We may all be living in the same world and seeing very different things, right? Listen, affirm, and guide students to resources. This is really important, especially for those of us who live in the instructional side of the house. So I worked on both sides of that house. We have to know, talk to each other enough, right? So we, kind of handle our classrooms. We do great jobs there, but we don't always know how to connect folks with the resources we may have on campus, right? So what we really want to think about is how do we serve our students holistically as all the person that they are. And actively challenge policies, programs, and practices that exclude queer and trans people, right? Look at those and think, how does that work? As we look around our campuses, are our facilities welcoming to particularly our trans and gender nonconforming folks? What are we doing about that? Are we asking folks to be accountable around that kind of behavior? If you don't have an affirmative name policy on a campus, we do, right? But if you don't, why don't we? Why is that not the case? Okay. I thank you so much for spending some time with me today. This is actually tons of fun for me because I haven't taught in a few years. And so any opportunity to teach, I will take it. So, or, at least co-facilitate, whatever, so I really, really appreciate that. Do not love this high flex experience at all, so I'm just gonna stop doing that. That's just a personal thing, but I thank you all so much for your time and your attention. Please don't ever hesitate to reach out to me if you have any questions. I do encourage you to take a look at the California Community College LGBTQ+ Summit. I have been the lead of this for several years. We're doing a lot of great work across the state to try to make systemic changes across the state. And it's just a great summit with lots of information. And if I can ever be of service, please do not hesitate to reach out. Have a wonderful flex.
Great work, Emily.
Oh, that was a rough start, man. Rough start.
You did what many of us have not or too scared to do. So thank you for showing us how it's done. You were excellent. Thank you. Thank you.
I really do miss it. I wish everybody was here. I get why we weren't. I wish we just would have done Zoom instead. Do you know what I mean? It was that thing that just didn't work. But
well, I really think it's twofold. Now we can actually see what I haven't seen what something like this could possibly look like. So I think it was great.
Right now, it's not good.
Yeah.
It's not good. I don't think the online experience for you all is good.